Welcome to Hybiz News. My name is Suresh Kochatil. The COVID-19 pandemic has rightly put the focus back on China, on where China should stand in relation to the world order. From an aggressive United States to a laid-back countries of Africa, China is now at the center of attention. It actually came out with a virus and now is providing medicine for the same virus. And that's the irony of it. To discuss this and all more, we have with us an expert in this field, Raka Sudhakar Rao, who for a long time was in the northeast of India and with close proximity to Chinese border as we see it, understands the issues at depth. A very senior journalist, Rakaji knows the issue like an open hand that he is an expert at.
Hello Sureshji.
Raka Sudhakarji, thank you for speaking to us Hybiz News.
Thank you so much, sir.
Now China today is at the crossroads of history, political history, military history, and even a pandemic history. It created a pandemic, it created a virus that came out of Wuhan, now spread across the world, killing more than 2 lakh people as we stand today. Yes. And China's position is today pretty delicate. What according to you is the reason why we have come to this correct?
Well, China is guilty basically of informing the globe quite late when it came to the pandemic. It should have informed somewhere in January, but then till February 15, China and the World Health Organization were insisting that this pandemic does not spread from man to man or from human to human contact. So this is where they floundered, and by the time the whole pandemic became uncontrollable, even within China, it could have been very well contained somewhere in the month of October or November. But then they allowed it to grow out of proportions, and then it took quite some time for China to contain it. And the most important issue is the globe was unprepared. The rest of the world was unprepared for this pandemic. To understand the nature of pandemic, I think both the World Health Organization as well as China have failed in informing the world, and that's where the whole problem comes. And more importantly, the Chinese are now claiming to be experts in controlling the pandemic and are trying to peddle the same prescriptions that they have used in their country. And there is this very funny incident of undergarments being sent to Pakistan as masks. The Pakistan has rejected them. One of the most faithful and trusted ally of China has rejected their material. Even the PPEs, personal protection equipment that has been sent to India, has been found to be substandard. So China, it's a double jeopardy for China, because one, its image is seriously dented because of the way it has handled the pandemic in the initial days. And then the world is not trusting the figures doled out by the Chinese authorities. The numbers that they're trying to dole out, and the numbers and the statistics that they're trying to put out are not being trusted by the countries across the world. And thirdly, the prescriptions that China is trying to peddle across the world are also proving quite inadequate, and that way the China is in a double jeopardy. But of course, despite all these things, China will carry the day because of its economic clout more than anything else. It is a very powerful military force in the world. Strategically, it's expanding its footprint across the world. But more importantly, it's the economic clout. The kind of reserves they have can help China rebuild its economy, one, and it has already committed huge funds to various East Asian and African countries. So particularly the countries of the North and Central Africa. So these countries are not in a position to take on China despite the erosion of credibility. These countries are not in a position to question China. The same is true with the European Union also. European Union is unable to side with America openly because of this reason. China has committed so much in terms of finances in these countries, and their economies are dependent on China. So this is the reason why China is able to get away in the first place, despite its flawed handling of the pandemic.
The second question, Rakaji, is China is today flexing its political and even military muscles. It is trying to browbeat the smaller nations of Southeast Asia, and even in midst of this pandemic, carrying out a naval exercise in the South China Sea. What do you think is the strategy of the Chinese Communist Party, or maybe if you want to call it the Chinese government as such, in this scenario?
China is too big for this pandemic. That's the first thing. Its economy in other states has not been affected to that extent. So that's one reason why China can immediately stand up. And the second thing is the kind of reserves that China has, expendable reserves that it can invest across the world. It can invest in various projects. The ambitious BRI, the Belt Road Initiative project, is one instrument through which China can extend its economic and infrastructural hegemony across the world. In fact, some people have said, derisively, that one belt, one road, one virus. So that's most of the countries in the OBOR regime are among the first countries that have been affected by the virus, but still they are unable to openly take on China because of the kind of investments, particularly in case of Italy. The investment in the leather industry, the investment in the infrastructure sector, I think this is one factor that is weighing so heavily on the Italian government. So Italy was one of the countries which was among the last to actually ban flights to Wuhan, so let alone China. So and they're paying for it, but then these governments are unable to fight back because of the Chinese economic clout and the BRI infrastructure that has already been committed in these countries, especially in countries like Spain, in countries like Pakistan, in countries like some of the East Asian countries, even in the Central Asian countries. I think Afghanistan, China hasn't committed much as of now, but then it has plans to commit its funds and its infrastructure in that country in the reconstruction of the Afghanistan post the US withdrawal. So all these factors I believe have ensured that these countries remain largely silent, though its credibility has been lost considerably. There's a loss of face as far as China is concerned, but then the economic cloud, economic levers it has, I think it will be able to use them and browbeat the whole world. Central African Republic, the East African countries, the European Union, and the smaller countries in the Australasian region, the Polynesian Islands, I think these are not in a position to actually take on China. That's one reason why China is getting away despite its mistakes. Yeah. So we must know that China is a very ambitious player with a long-term vision, long-term plans, and South China Sea has been a bone of contention for China. China always claims, China has a very interesting method. On one hand, it says that an ocean cannot be named after a country. It says there cannot be an Indian Ocean. But at the same time, it wants the sea named after it, South China Sea and the East China Sea, to be under their complete hegemony. This is a very interesting thing that China, doublespeak that China resorts to. China needs the exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea as well as the East China and also the Indian Ocean. So to grab as much exclusive economic zone as possible, it wants to lay claim on the islands like the Spratly Islands, the Paracel Islands, and all these islands that are there in the South China Sea as well as the East China Sea. Some of these islands are abutting actually Japan. So they want to have control over these islands. They are creating new islands and by reclamation, and these lands, once they are seen as part of China, they can claim 200 square kilometers of exclusive economic zone beyond these islands. See, the Chinese expansionism in South China Sea is not just military. It is far more important. It wants control over the exclusive economic zone in both South China Sea as well as the East China Sea and also in the Pacific, not to speak of the Indian Ocean. So all these areas it wants to extend its exclusive economic zone, which is 200 square kilometers of the area. So by constructing new islands, by building new islands or through reclamation process, and also by occupying the small islands like hitherto considered useless, Parasail Islands, Spratly Islands, these this is one way of extending Chinese economic hegemony in these regions. So China is basically more interested, of course it has its own military objectives, it wants to control access to the sea lanes of communications, the SLOCs, SLOCs, that so it wants to control the SLOCs, the Malacca Strait and the other straits, also the Indian Ocean channels, particularly the 10-degree channel that passes through the between the near the, that passes close to the Andaman Nicobar group. So China wants control over all these regions. That's one major issue, and in the process of controlling, it is also trying to usurp the economic zones or the marine wealth that is available. So this is one reason why it is getting involved, getting active, trying to turn the South China Sea into a hot spot. It has standing disputes with Vietnam, it has standing disputes with even minuscule countries like Brunei over the marine rights and marine wealth. So I think this is going to play out because we are looking at a new world order post COVID. I think China is looking beyond that, and the exercises, the naval exercises, are part of its overall plans for a post COVID strategic world.
President Trump has taken a very aggressive stance on China after this pandemic, even to an extent calling it a Chinese virus and trying to take on his own media in the country, in the United States, against China. Even today, we saw pretty aggressive statements from him saying China has to pay for this. Germany sent billions of euros to China. Is the world, especially the United States, going to take a very aggressive stand? They already had aggressive stands in terms of the trade relations. Is it going to get worse as we see for the next few months?
One of the interesting things about Donald Trump is that he has limited himself to verbal assaults. Beyond that, he is not doing much, and he has not spelt out his strategy for China as such, because he is in an election year. He is trying to score brownie points over his political rivals, and his audience seem to be not the global audience but the audience inside the United States of America, where he is looking to get re-elected as the president. So as of now, he doesn't seem to be spelling out a concrete plan of action to contain for China's containment. So his perorations, I must say, are basically trying to cater the local audience and sway them electorally. This is one big thing. And outside America, on the world theater, Donald Trump's record as someone who keeps his promises across the world has been dismal. He has walked out of many global treaties, and he has shown that for him America first means even walking out of well-established treaties. So the credibility of Trump government at this stage in the global world order is very low because of his maverick ways, one, and then secondly walking out of various pacts and agreements and protocols. Germany may have sent a bill to China, and even Japan has allocated $2.2 billion for any Japanese company that wants to move out of China and invest elsewhere. So a lot of other countries are also coming. Germany, in fact Japan has done this, and several other countries also may move out of China. So one possibility is these countries may walk out of China, they can move their investments and they can set up their units outside China, which is an opportunity for India. Secondly, I do not immediately foresee global sort of a conglomeration against China immediately, because even the European Union seems to be in two minds when it comes to tackling China. So European Union is the second biggest bloc after US and China, economically speaking. So if the EU doesn't actually take on, then the whole fight becomes very weak, and the credibility of Donald Trump actually is one of the off-putting factors in this whole thing.
The World Health Organization, especially its Director General, has been accused of mollycoddling with China. They say he got elected because of his close proximity to the Chinese political establishment. Much as United States withdrew the funding for World Health Organization, China is upping the ante by providing more cash to the World Health Organization. What is the politics being played out here?
It's not just WHO. WHO is a very important case, but at the same time, it's not just WHO. China is trying to control all global institutions, including UN, because of its veto power, and then also various other global organizations. It has instituted its own fund to support the OBOR projects and the projects elsewhere. It has created huge infrastructural funding agencies within China using the financial reserves it has. So China today doesn't really need IMF. China is actually funding various countries and is trying to create, it has the BRICS also, BRICS bank also. China has a huge stake. So China is now trying to financially control the world through its own funding agencies, and then it's using its leverage and its infrastructural projects across the smaller countries in Asia and Africa to get votes on its side. So in any global forum, China is now able to exercise far more influence than it used to earlier. And as for the World Health Organization is concerned, the incumbent Director General, as you said, is a very unpronounceable name, tongue twister of a name. Tedros is one that is easy for us. Then his election is entirely dependent on, his victory was entirely dependent on Chinese clout, Chinese diplomatic, economic clout, and it got votes for him. And the US, after the withdrawal of US funding, I think now it will be more dependent on Chinese funds, and China will be the biggest funder for this organization, and the WHO will definitely depend more on China. It's not just, but then let us be very clear about it. This is not just about World Health Organization. All other world organizations are sought to be subverted, because China is investing hugely in these countries, and luring them, drawing them into a debt trap. These countries will not be able to browbeat China or able to refuse an offer from China. These countries will be in a catch-22 kind of situation where they will be left with no alternative but to vote for or toe the Chinese line. Most of these countries, for instance, we know the way Chinese control the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. So the same way they are doing in Burma, Myanmar, they are doing the same thing in Bangladesh. They are investing heavily, and the trap is set in such a way that this country cannot actually overstep beyond the brief that China gives them. So this, the way China is trying to subvert the world global institutions is a matter of serious concern, and America, unfortunately, is so much engrossed within itself that it is unable to play the global role that it has claimed for itself all these years.
India always had a delicate relationship with China, even though Nehru had his Hindi, Chini, Bhai Bhai and all that. But we underwent 2 wars with them, and we lost, in a sense of the word, there. China always has been aggressive in its relationship with what we do in Arunachal Pradesh, and also with the Tibetan exile in government in India. What, according to you, should be India's position now that China is slightly on the back foot after this virus?
Then India has a very fine balancing to do. Actually, it has a very fine balancing that it has to do, because on one hand it has a huge neighbor, huge in all respects, even in terms of population, economy, militarily. China is a huge neighbor, and India has to ensure that it has the best of relations with China on one hand. It has also a global role to play in the American scheme of things. America long ago has actually dehyphenated Indo-Pak, and it tried to introduce what is known as Indo-Pacific. It tried to hyphenate India with the Pacific Islands. A long time ago, almost 10 or 15 years ago, Indo-Pak was dehyphenated. Now it is AFPAC, and this is now Indo-Pacific. So America wants India to be proactive, more proactive in terms of China's containment. But then India has its own priorities. While it has to address the American concerns, it also has to address its own relationship with China. India does not want a war at this stage, and nor does China want a war at this stage. That is one reason why, one silver lining in the Indo-China relationships is since 1967, not a single shot was fired in the India-China border, which extends to more than 4,000 or 5,000 kilometers. Not a single shot was fired. Even during Doklam, it was a hand-to-hand combat, pushes and shoves, not even a combat. Doklam technically is not an Indian territory, it's a Bhutanese territory, but Bhutan has a military agreement with India, and India has a responsibility there in protecting the Bhutanese geopolitical and geostrategic interests. But be that as it may, India and China both do not want a war at this stage. So this game of Chinese checkers is playing. They're playing this game of chess. So India needs to factor in its relationship with China on one hand, and also its relationships with the US on the other hand. So we need to do a lot of fine balancing. India also has to protect its interests from the Chinese economic depredations. Strategically, the encirclement is almost complete, because now they have a CPEC that passes through Pakistan and ends up in Gwadar and provides access to them into the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, northwestern Indian Ocean. So and then we also have this containment related encirclement related issues. So India has a fine balancing to do. It has to, on one hand, contain China, on the other hand, maintain a peaceful border, resolve its issues. And as far as I understand, Arunachal Pradesh is being used as a lever to torment and trouble and poke India whenever India tries to do something in its relations with China. But China's main interest lies in the Aksai Chin area and the Chinese occupied Ladakh region. That's where it's Karakoram and then Siachen. These are the areas where China is more interested rather than the Arunachal Pradesh, which is a logistical nightmare for the Chinese. Particularly the Sikkim Nathula is is advantageous to the Indian forces. So China would like to keep this border on the boil, but at the same time it does not want to make it a hot spot the way the India's western border is. So both India as well as China have this self-interest to address, and then they also have to factor in the US and play their game cautiously and wisely.
Rakaji, this is the last question, and my obvious question would be, when you look at the entire scenario that's unfolding right now, what according to you will be the final political, geopolitical, military realignment after this entire COVID-19 episode is done and dusted with?
Post-COVID world, already the signs of the US decline, of US dominance are all too visible, and COVID only will accentuate them, because America has become so self-protective that it will not be able to play the global role that it envisages for itself. And secondly, as you rightly said, it's very difficult for many countries to stand on their own legs, economically speaking. Even China has economic challenges, huge economic challenges. It has committed huge amounts to lot of nations across the world, and it has to make those funds available, and if it is unable to do that, its stock will go down. So China also has a lot of challenges to address, and then it has also geopolitical issues to address. So how in the post-COVID, maybe 1 year down the line, I think India can hope to become a more meaningful a more purposeful player in the global scheme of things, because India is one country whose economy is different from many other economies across the world. Ours is basically a consumption based economy. So standing up resurrection of the manufacturing sector will become easier. It will not be export oriented, it is internal consumption oriented. So India's economic yesterday our Reserve Bank, former Reserve Bank Chairman Subbarao Garu has said that it could be like a V-shaped growth for India. A V-shaped growth means a sudden drastic fall and an equally sudden rise. So it could be a possibility for India, given the fact that India is basically manufacture oriented and the consumption is internal. So the market is readily available for India, unlike many other countries which are export oriented and may not find customers outside their country. So this could be one factor which can actually make India stronger. The way India has dealt with the COVID crisis, marshalling whatever resources it has and putting them to optimal use, at the same time realizing its weaknesses and trying to minimize those weaknesses. This is where India has succeeded, and when bigger countries and more equipped countries like Spain, US, Italy have floundered, India has done slightly better. In the post-COVID world, we can see a stronger India towards which the world, the Committee of Nations will look towards for solutions. And as far as I can see, China's credibility has taken a beating. So then China has a lot to address. More importantly for China, for the first time in Chinese history, there is internal dissidence which is manifesting very clearly. For example, on the social media sphere, there are articles criticizing Xi Jinping as an emperor without clothes. This has never happened during any time in the Chinese history. And there are dissidents within China, and there is a dissident leader who has criticized Xi Jinping's policies and has managed to evade arrest for 40 days. Not exactly China will be able to control and contain this this dissidents, but then Xi Jinping's leadership is seriously challenged within China itself. Is something that needs to be taken into account. We may not be able to see the kind of overthrow of the regime or even the Tiananmen Square kind of revolution, but then this is a serious thing that the Chinese, particularly there were protests when this doctor who first told the world about the corona died in a hospital. So these kinds of protests were unheard of in China. So China too has huge challenges winning over its own people and also playing its role in the global economy, global strategic environment, and then it has its own commitments to address. For example, now there are doubts whether most of these CPEC commitments would ever take off. There are, even in Pakistan, doubts are being expressed whether the CPEC will become a reality, and whether the OR commitments, the Belt or Road Initiative commitments are, whether they will truly take off. So these are the questions that are there. All depends on the kind of response that US is going to put out, because US has been found to be quite inadequate in addressing COVID, in addressing the geopolitical and geostrategic and global economic issues that arose out of the COVID response. It has shown itself to be quite weak when fighting the bioterrorism. So this is one factor that could spur a lot of bioterror attacks within the US. So we do not really, the post COVID world is going to be a world of both challenges as well as opportunities for India. How things play out, it remains to be seen.
Thank you for speaking to us at Hybiz News, Mr. Raka Sudhakar ji. It was enlightening to hear your views in depth as an expert in this subject. Thank you for speaking to us.
It's a pleasure, sir. Thank you.
This is Suresh Kochatal from Hybiz News signing off. Thank you for watching.